The intake nurse sees the blood first. It has soaked through the field, dressing around the lower half of the boy's face, dark red turning rust brown in the light of the camp hospital tent. He is 19 years old, a German Wehrmacht soldier captured somewhere in the final chaotic weeks of the European campaign. And when the nurse asks him his name, he tries to answer, but the sound that comes out is not a word. It is a wet, choked noise from somewhere behind shattered bone. The doctor steps closer and unwraps the dressing, and what he sees stops him mid-motion. The lower jaw is not just broken. It is crushed inward on the left side. Fragments of mandible pushed back toward the throat, teeth missing, soft tissue swollen to twice its normal size. The injury was not from shrapnel or a grenade. It was from a rifle butt, delivered with enough force to destroy the architecture of a human face. The prisoner arrived at a United States Army field hospital in Germany in late April 1945, part of a transport convoy carrying wounded and sick prisoners of war from temporary holding areas to stabilized medical facilities behind the advancing Allied lines. Records from this period describe thousands of German soldiers flooding into Allied custody every day, many of them teenagers, conscripted in the final desperate months of the war when the Wehrmacht scraped the bottom of its manpower reserves. This boy was one of them, but his injury set him apart immediately. Most prisoners arrived with minor wounds, exhaustion, or malnutrition. He arrived with a face that could no longer perform its basic functions: eating, drinking, speaking. The intake form noted his approximate age, his unit designation, and a single phrase in the medical notes: mandibular fracture, severe displacement, infection likely. The doctor who examined him that first day was a United States Army captain, a maxillofacial surgeon who had been rotating through field hospitals since the Normandy invasion. He had treated jaw injuries before, from tank crew burns to direct fire wounds, but this case troubled him for a different reason. The fracture pattern was clean in one sense: blunt force trauma, single impact, no secondary wounds. That meant the injury was deliberate and isolated. Someone had struck this boy hard enough to break his jaw, and then someone else had decided to send him into the prisoner system anyway, knowing he could not eat solid food or explain what had happened. The doctor made a note in the chart and then made a decision. No transfer yet. The boy would stay here until the swelling came down and the risk of suffocation passed. Only then could they assess whether surgery was even possible. The nurse assigned to his care was a corporal from Ohio, 24 years old, who had been working in field hospitals since North Africa. She had learned to manage her reactions to suffering, but when she brought the first meal tray to the boy's cot, she felt something break in her professional distance. He looked at the food with an expression she could not read at first, then turned his head away. It was not refusal, it was shame. He knew he could not eat it, and he did not want her to watch him fail. She brought him a cup of broth instead, held it to his lips, and watched him try to swallow. Half of it spilled down his chin because the left side of his mouth would not seal. She wiped his face without comment and brought another cup. By the third attempt, he managed to keep most of it down. She marked the intake on his chart: 4 ounces, tolerated poorly, aspiration risk high. Let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else? We would love to know who is keeping these stories alive. Over the next 3 days, the boy's condition stabilized enough for the medical team to piece together what had happened, not from his words but from the physical evidence, and from fragments of testimony given by other prisoners in the same transport group. The boy had been captured near a small town in Thuringia during the first week of April, part of a Wehrmacht unit that had been cut off and surrounded by American infantry, advancing faster than German command could reposition. Most of the unit surrendered without resistance. They were exhausted, out of ammunition, and facing overwhelming numbers. But one officer, a lieutenant in his early 30s, refused to accept the collapse. He lined up the surviving soldiers and demanded they prepare for a breakout attempt. When the 19-year-old soldier hesitated and suggested they surrender to avoid pointless deaths, the lieutenant walked up to him in front of the entire group and struck him across the face with the wooden stock of his rifle. The blow landed with enough force to drop the boy to the ground. Witnesses said they heard the crack of bone even over the distant sound of artillery. The lieutenant stood over him and said something about cowardice, about disgrace, about the duty of German soldiers to fight until death. Then the American forces moved in, the breakout never happened, and the entire group was taken into custody. The lieutenant disappeared into the prisoner system, his name recorded but his fate unclear. The boy was loaded onto a truck with a field dressing tied around his face, still conscious but unable to speak or protest. No one cleaned the wound properly for 2 days. By the time he reached the field hospital, the tissue was infected and the bone fragments had begun to shift. The story came out in pieces, told by other soldiers in the ward who recognized the boy from the surrender. One of them, a corporal from the same unit, told the nurse that the lieutenant had been growing more unstable for weeks, ordering senseless attacks and threatening soldiers who showed any hesitation. The jaw injury was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a command structure that had collapsed into paranoia and rage as the war turned against Germany. The nurse reported this to the doctor, who added it to the medical file with a note that the injury was sustained under circumstances consistent with assault by a superior officer. That note would follow the boy through the rest of his time in custody, a small bureaucratic acknowledgement of something that military justice would never address. The infection worsened before it improved. The boy's temperature spiked to 103 degrees Fahrenheit on the 4th night, and the doctor made the decision to drain the abscess that had formed along the fracture line. There was no operating room available, so the procedure was done at the bedside with local anesthetic and a scalpel sterilized over a flame. The boy did not cry out, but his hands gripped the sides of the cot hard enough to leave marks in the canvas. When the abscess drained, the smell was overwhelming, a mix of pus and blood and decaying tissue. The nurse held a basin under his chin and kept her face neutral while the doctor worked. Afterward, the boy's fever broke and he slept for 14 hours straight, the first real sleep he had managed since the injury. By the end of the first week, the swelling had reduced enough for the doctor to perform a full assessment of the damage. He brought in a dental officer, a major who had trained as an oral surgeon before the war, and together they examined the boy's jaw with the kind of attention usually reserved for complicated reconstruction cases. The major's conclusion was blunt. The fracture was repairable in theory, but not here and not now. The boy would need wiring, possibly bone grafts, and a surgical environment with reliable anesthesia and post-operative monitoring. None of that existed in a field hospital that was still moving every few days to keep up with the front lines. The best they could do was stabilize the fracture with external support, keep the infection under control, and hope that a permanent facility could take him before the bone healed incorrectly. The external support came in the form of a cloth and wire harness that wrapped around the boy's head and held his jaw in a semi-closed position. It was uncomfortable and restrictive, but it prevented further displacement of the bone fragments and gave the soft tissue a chance to heal. The boy tolerated it without complaint, which surprised the medical staff until they realized he had no frame of reference for how prisoner of war medical care was supposed to work. He had been told by German propaganda that Allied captors would torture or execute prisoners. Instead, he was being fed liquid meals, given pain medication, and treated by a surgeon who checked on him twice a day. The cognitive dissonance was visible on his face, a mix of confusion and cautious relief that he could not articulate because his jaw was wired shut. The question of surgery became a question of logistics. The field hospital was scheduled to move again within 10 days, and the boy was not stable enough to travel long distances without risking re-injury. The doctor requested a transfer to a Rural hospital in France, one of the semi-permanent facilities that had been set up to handle complex cases that could not be treated on the move. The request was approved, but the transport would not leave for another 2 weeks. In the meantime, the boy remained in the ward, one cot among dozens, watched over by a medical team that had moved on to new cases but still checked his chart every morning. During those 2 weeks, something unexpected happened. The boy began to communicate. He could not speak, but he could write, and the nurse brought him a pencil and a small notebook that had been left behind by another patient. At first, he wrote only his name and his hometown, a village in Bavaria near the Austrian border. Then he wrote short sentences in careful German script, asking questions about where he was, how long he would be held, whether his family would be notified. The nurse could not read German, so she brought the notebook to a translator, a private who had grown up in a German-speaking family in Pennsylvania. The translator read the questions aloud and then wrote responses in the same notebook, simple answers that avoided making promises about the future. The boy read the responses and nodded, and over the next few days the notebook became a lifeline, a way to assert some small measure of agency in a situation where he had almost none. Let us pause here and place this story into the larger context of what was happening across Europe in the spring of 1945. By the end of April, the Western Allies held more than 2 million German prisoners of war in temporary camps, field hospitals, and transit facilities scattered across France, Belgium, and Western Germany. The Soviet Union held millions more on the Eastern Front, under conditions far harsher than anything the boy in this story would experience. The sheer scale of the collapse meant that processing, feeding, and providing medical care for prisoners became one of the largest logistical challenges of the entire war. The United States Army alone was capturing an average of 25,000 German soldiers per day during the final 3 weeks of April, faster than camps could be built or supplies could be allocated. Medical resources were stretched to the breaking point. Field hospitals designed to handle 200 patients were managing 600. Surgical teams worked in shifts around the clock, prioritizing life-threatening wounds and infectious diseases that could spread through overcrowded camps. Jaw fractures, even severe ones, ranked low on the triage list unless they posed an immediate risk of airway obstruction or starvation. The boy in this story received care not because his injury was the most serious, but because it landed in a facility that happened to have a maxillofacial surgeon on staff and enough breathing room to stabilize non-critical cases. The numbers behind facial trauma cases tell their own story. Military medical records from the European theater document over 15,000 jaw and facial fractures treated in Allied hospitals during the final 6 months of the war, caused by everything from shrapnel to vehicle accidents to blunt force trauma. Among German prisoners of war, blunt force injuries increased sharply in the last weeks of the conflict, a pattern that medical officers attributed to internal discipline breakdowns and summary punishments carried out by officers trying to maintain control over disintegrating units. The boy's case was not unique. It was part of a wave of similar injuries that reflected the violent collapse of the Wehrmacht's command structure as the war ended. One more number. The survival rate for mandibular fractures treated in Allied military hospitals was above 95%, even when surgery was delayed or impossible. The human jaw, despite its fragility, heals aggressively if infection can be controlled and basic nutrition maintained. That statistic would shape the rest of the boy's story, but it also highlights the contrast between his fate and the fate of prisoners held in harsher conditions. On the Eastern Front, where medical care for German prisoners was minimal or non-existent, similar injuries often meant death from starvation, infection, or exposure. The boy's survival depended on the accident of geography. He was captured by American forces in the West, not Soviet forces in the East. The transport convoy left on a rainy morning in early May, 2 days after Germany's unconditional surrender. The boy was loaded into the back of a canvas-covered truck, along with 11 other prisoners, all of them medical cases too complex or too fragile for the makeshift facilities near the front. The convoy traveled west through towns that still smelled of smoke and cordite, past columns of German prisoners walking under guard toward larger camps, past refugee families pushing carts piled with everything they had managed to save. The boy sat on a bench bolted to the side of the truck, his jaw harness hidden under a clean bandage, his notebook tucked into the pocket of the faded Wehrmacht tunic he still wore, because no one had issued him prisoner clothing yet. The journey took 3 days, with overnight stops at transit camps where the prisoners slept on straw in requisitioned barns or schoolhouses. At each stop, a medical officer inspected the group, checked charts, and cleared them to continue. The boy's chart was flagged for priority transfer, which meant he was moved to the front of the line when space opened up in the hospital convoy heading to a facility near Lyon. The other prisoners in his group asked him questions he could not answer, so eventually they stopped asking and left him alone. One of them, an older man with a leg wound, shared a piece of bread with him even though he knew the boy could not eat it. The gesture was enough. The boy folded the bread into his pocket and nodded his thanks. We are now in early May 1945, days after the war in Europe has officially ended. Now we move forward to the hospital near Lyon, where the boy will spend the next 4 months. The facility was a converted school building, 3 stories of stone and tile that had been transformed into a surgical hospital for prisoners of war requiring extended treatment. It had real operating rooms, X-ray equipment, and a staff of doctors and nurses who had been pulled from frontline duty now that the fighting was over. The boy arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and was assigned a bed in a ward on the 2nd floor, a long room with 20 cots and tall windows that let in more light than he had seen in weeks. The surgeon who took over his case was a lieutenant colonel from Massachusetts, a man in his late 40s who had been practicing oral surgery in Boston before the war. He reviewed the boy's chart, examined the jaw, and scheduled surgery for the following week. The procedure would involve opening the fracture site, removing bone fragments that could not be saved, wiring the remaining pieces into alignment, and closing the wound with internal sutures. The risks included infection, nerve damage, and permanent disfigurement. But without surgery, the boy's jaw would heal in a misaligned position that would make eating and speaking difficult for the rest of his life. The surgeon explained all of this through a translator, and the boy signed a consent form with a shaky signature. He had no real choice, but the act of signing gave him the illusion of one. The surgery took place on a Thursday morning in mid-May, under general anesthesia administered by an Army nurse anesthetist who had learned her trade in field hospitals from Normandy to the Rhine. The procedure lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, longer than expected because the bone fragments were more displaced than the X-rays had shown. The surgeon worked methodically, removing 3 pieces of dead bone, drilling holes in the remaining mandible, and threading surgical wire through the holes to hold everything in place. When he closed the wound, he used dissolvable sutures on the inside and silk sutures on the outside, a double layer to reduce the risk of the wound reopening during the healing process. The boy was moved to a recovery area where a nurse monitored his breathing until he woke up, groggy and disoriented, with a new bandage covering half his face. The pain was immediate and intense. Post-operative pain management in 1945 was limited to morphine injections, which the boy received every 4 hours for the first 3 days. Between injections, he lay still on his cot, eyes open, staring at the ceiling and trying not to move his head. The nurse who checked on him most often was a lieutenant from Virginia, a woman in her early 30s who had been overseas since 1943. She had seen enough suffering to recognize the difference between pain that needed intervention and pain that just needed time. She stayed with him during the worst hours, adjusting his pillow, wiping sweat from his forehead, and talking to him in English even though he could not understand most of the words. The tone of her voice was enough. By the end of the first week, the acute pain had dulled to a constant ache, and the boy was able to sit up and take liquid nutrition through a tube inserted into the corner of his mouth. The surgical wire held, the swelling decreased, and the risk of infection dropped as the wound began to heal cleanly. The surgeon checked on him every other day, inspecting the sutures and making notes in the chart about alignment and healing progress. On the 10th day post-surgery, he told the translator to inform the boy that the procedure had been successful and that his jaw would heal well enough to eat and speak normally within a few months. The boy's reaction was not relief. It was exhaustion. He had been living in survival mode for so long that the promise of a future felt abstract and unreal. The recovery process required patience that the boy did not know he had. The surgical wire would stay in place for 6 weeks, which meant 6 weeks of liquid meals, 6 weeks of not being able to open his mouth more than a few millimeters, 6 weeks of depending on other people for basic tasks like washing his face. He adapted by creating small routines, walking the length of the ward twice a day, writing in his notebook during the hours when he could not sleep, listening to the conversations of other prisoners even though he could not join them. One of the other patients, a sergeant from Hamburg who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite during the retreat from the Eastern Front, took an interest in him and began teaching him basic English phrases using hand gestures and exaggerated pronunciation. The boy learned "thank you" and "water" and "no problem" and practiced them silently, moving his lips without sound because his jaw was still wired. In late June, almost 2 months after his arrival at the Lyon Hospital, the Red Cross facilitated the first wave of family notifications for prisoners of war whose status had been confirmed and whose locations were stable enough to process correspondence. The boy was allowed to write a letter home, limited to 25 words, which would be translated, reviewed by camp censors, and forwarded through the International Red Cross mail system to his family in Bavaria. He spent an entire afternoon composing those 25 words, crossing out sentences, rewriting, and finally settling on a message that said he was alive, in a hospital, injured but recovering, and that he hoped they were safe. He signed his name and handed the letter to the ward clerk, who added it to a stack of hundreds of similar letters waiting to be processed. The response came 5 weeks later, a single sheet of thin paper covered in his mother's handwriting. She wrote that the family had survived the war, that their village had been occupied by American forces without major fighting, and that his younger brother was working on a farm to help with food supplies. She asked about his injury but did not press for details, as if she understood instinctively that some things could not be explained in a censored letter. She ended by saying she prayed for him every night and that she would wait as long as necessary for him to come home. The boy read the letter 4 times, then folded it carefully and kept it under his pillow. The boy's connection to his family, fragile and mediated through Red Cross mail, became the emotional anchor that carried him through the rest of his recovery. He wrote 3 more letters over the next 2 months, each one slightly longer as the censors relaxed restrictions, and as his ability to articulate his situation improved. His mother wrote back each time, her letters filled with small details about village life and careful reassurances that they were managing despite the hardships. Neither of them mentioned the lieutenant who had broken his jaw. That subject remained unspoken, a wound that would not heal through correspondence. In early July, the surgeon removed the surgical wire in a procedure that took less than 10 minutes but felt like an eternity to the boy. The wire had been in place for 7 weeks, long enough for the bone to knit together, but not so long that the wire itself caused complications. The surgeon used small pliers to cut the wire at each anchor point, then pulled the pieces out through the incision sites with a steady, practiced motion. The boy felt each pull as a strange tugging sensation deep in his jaw, not quite pain but profoundly unsettling. When the last piece came out, the surgeon stepped back and told him to try opening his mouth. The boy hesitated, then moved his jaw slowly downward. It opened 3 centimeters, then stopped. The muscles had atrophied during the weeks of immobilization, and it would take time and physical therapy to regain full range of motion. The first solid food he attempted was a piece of soft bread soaked in broth, served to him by the same nurse who had cared for him during the worst days after surgery. He bit down carefully, felt the bread compress between his teeth, and began to chew with slow, deliberate motions. The left side of his jaw ached immediately, a deep soreness that made him wince, but he kept chewing until the bread was soft enough to swallow. It took him almost 5 minutes to eat that single piece, and when he finished, he looked at the nurse with an expression that she later described in a letter home as pure triumph. He had done something that most people never think about, something so basic that its absence had defined his existence for 3 months. He had eaten a piece of bread. Over the next 2 weeks, he progressed from soft bread to mashed vegetables to small pieces of meat, each new texture a milestone that the medical staff tracked with the same attention they gave to fever charts and wound healing. His jaw strength improved slowly, but the left side remained weaker than the right, and he learned to compensate by chewing mostly on the right side. The surgeon warned him that he would probably experience chronic pain and limited mobility for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the injury. The boy accepted this information with a nod. He had already adjusted his expectations downward so many times that one more limitation did not feel like a tragedy. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are bringing you stories that most history books never covered. The act of eating became a form of therapy, not just physical but psychological. Each meal was proof that he was recovering, that he was moving away from the helplessness of the early days. The other prisoners in the ward noticed the change in him and began including him in conversations, no longer treating him as the silent boy who could not participate. He still struggled to speak clearly, his words slurred and his pronunciation distorted by the scar tissue and the weakened muscles, but he could make himself understood. That was enough. By August 1945, the hospital near Lyon had transitioned from a treatment facility to a transit point for prisoners awaiting repatriation. The war was over, but the process of returning millions of German prisoners to a defeated and occupied Germany was slow and chaotic. Priority was given to prisoners from Western Germany, where the infrastructure for receiving and processing returnees was more stable. The boy, whose home village was in the American occupation zone, was placed on a list for an October transport. In the meantime, he remained in the hospital, no longer a patient but not yet free, occupying a strange in-between status that dozens of other recovered prisoners shared. He used the time to continue his physical therapy and to improve his English. The German sergeant who had taught him the first basic phrases had been repatriated in July, but another prisoner, a former school teacher from Dresden, took over the informal lessons. The teacher had no materials, so he used whatever he could find. Labels on medical supplies, posters on the ward walls, conversations overheard from the staff. The boy proved to be a quick learner, motivated by the practical realization that English might be useful in an occupied Germany where American soldiers would be present for years. By the end of August, he could hold simple conversations, enough to thank the nurses, ask for water, and explain his injury when someone asked about the scar on his jaw. We are now in late September 1945, months after the surgery and weeks away from repatriation. Now, we move toward the final chapter of the boy's time in custody. The hospital was winding down its operations, preparing to transfer remaining patients to other facilities and to demobilize staff who were eligible to return to civilian life. The boy and a group of about 30 other prisoners were moved to a holding area in a converted barracks on the edge of the hospital grounds, where they slept on bunks and ate meals in a mess hall that had once served French soldiers. The conditions were basic but adequate, far better than the overcrowded camps where most prisoners had spent the summer. The boy's final medical evaluation took place in mid-September. The surgeon examined his jaw one last time, noted that the healing was complete and that the alignment was acceptable, and signed off on his fitness for transport. The emotional weight of impending release was complicated. The boy was eager to see his family, but he also felt a deep anxiety about returning to a country that had been destroyed and reshaped by defeat. His mother's letters had been carefully optimistic, but he could read between the lines. Food shortages, housing damage, the presence of occupation forces, the slow grind of rebuilding. He would be returning as a defeated soldier with a permanent injury to a family that might not have the resources to support him. The future was uncertain in ways that captivity had not been. In captivity, the rules were clear, and survival was the only goal. In freedom, he would have to figure out how to live again. The transport convoy departed on October 9th, a column of trucks carrying 400 German prisoners from the Lyon area toward the German border. The boy sat in the back of the third truck, his small bundle of possessions on his lap, watching the French countryside roll pass through the gap in the canvas. The other prisoners were mostly quiet, each of them absorbed in their own thoughts about what waited at the end of the journey. At the German border, the convoy was met by American military police, who checked paperwork and transferred the prisoners to a processing camp in the French occupation zone. The boy spent 2 days there, undergoing medical screening, identity verification, and a final debriefing before being cleared for release. The final leg of the journey was by train, a slow-moving freight train that stopped at every town and village along the route to drop off small groups of returning prisoners. The boy's stop was a rural station 10 kilometers from his home village, a wooden platform next to empty fields and a single road leading south. He stepped off the train with 6 other men, all of them from nearby towns, and they stood together for a moment in the late afternoon light, unsure of what to do next. Then one of the men said something about walking home before dark, and they began moving, a ragged line of former soldiers following a dirt road that had not changed while the world around it collapsed and rebuilt. The boy reached his village just before sunset. He walked past the church, past the houses he had known since childhood, and stopped in front of a small cottage with a vegetable garden in the front yard. His mother was outside, hanging laundry on a line, and she did not see him at first. He said her name, his voice rough and distorted but unmistakably his, and she turned and froze. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then she dropped the laundry and ran to him, and he caught her in an embrace that hurt his jaw but which he did not break. His younger brother came out of the house, grown taller than the boy remembered, and stood watching until their mother pulled him into the embrace as well. They did not ask about the scar on his face that night. There would be time for explanations later. The boy whose jaw was broken by a rifle butt in April 1945 lived the rest of his life in the same village where he was born. He never returned to military service, never spoke publicly about his experience as a prisoner of war, and never pursued any kind of justice against the officer who had injured him. The officer's fate remains unknown, lost in the chaos of the war's final days and the mass processing of millions of prisoners. The boy worked as a carpenter, married in 1950, and raised 3 children in a house he built himself on land his family had owned for generations. He died in 1998 at the age of 72. His jaw still carrying the slight misalignment that surgery had been unable to fully correct. His story survives in fragmented form, documented in American military medical records, Red Cross correspondence, and a single interview conducted in the 1980s by a German researcher studying the experiences of Wehrmacht soldiers in Allied captivity. In that interview, he described the injury, the surgery, and the care he received with a tone that the researcher described as detached but not bitter. He said that the American doctors and nurses had treated him with more humanity than his own officer had shown, and that this fact had shaped his view of the war and its aftermath in ways he still struggled to articulate decades later. He refused to describe the experience as traumatic, insisting that many others had suffered worse. But the researcher noted that his hand went to his jaw repeatedly during the conversation, touching the scar as if to confirm it was still there. The medical records from the Lyon Hospital provide a final detail that completes the picture. In a follow-up report written 6 months after the boy's repatriation, the surgeon who had performed the operation noted that the procedure had been successful in restoring function, but that the patient would likely experience chronic pain and reduced mobility for life. The report also included a brief notation about the circumstances of the injury, describing it as consistent with deliberate assault.